Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Markets, finance, and scandals. And, you know, it's a currency war. Bum, bum, bum. China versus America. Here's a bootleg copy of Chow Yun Fat in a remake of A Better Tomorrow, John Woo flick. We're going to play a little dialogue here. I'll give you the translation. It's something for today's times. Hit that dialogue. Round Eye going to lose in this currency war. Tim Geithner going to get it. Chop, chop. Ben Bernanke, he a big liar. We're going to totally destroy American economy. You see? That's the kind of intensity that America is unprepared to deal with. Chinese Bruce Lee type guys with all the money that was given to them from people who shopped at Walmart. Get the picture? Loser! All right, let's bring in political analyst and all-around nice gal, Stacy Herbert.
Well, Max, I'm going to meet your currency war video with one of my own, and this is from 2009, when the issue of sovereign wealth funds was big news, in particular, the gigantic size of China's massive dollar holdings. And this is what he said about that trade deficit that you're suggesting there in that Chow Yun Fat video.
If we run a negative trade balance with China of $250 billion this year or something of the sort, they're going to have $250 billion of U.S. somethings. And they're picking equities now. And in the end, you know, it's kind of interesting. They produce the $250 billion net of goods. People work hard over there. They work extra hours to send us shoes and send us a lot of the things you see in this store. And we send them little pieces of paper.
Who was that?
That was Warren Buffett.
Oh, Warren Buffett. Oh, right. Yeah. Well, see, he's a bonehead because they did send China all kinds of little pieces of paper, trillions of them. And in the 21st century currency war, that's the ammunition of choice. So America blew trillions on wars in Afghanistan and Iraq buying hardware, tanks, missiles, drone bombers. Meanwhile, China's been accumulating the actual ammunition used in the currency war, which is currency.
Yeah, okay, those little pieces of paper are currency, but at the end of the day, the currency war is about devaluing that currency that they hold. And the headline on this reads, "Financiers offer terms to the rest of the world in the currency wars." So this is from Jesse's Cafe American, and he's saying Anglo-American financiers to the rest of the world, we've got a gun to our heads. Better surrender. So he's discussing a Martin Wolf editorial in the Financial Times, in which Martin Wolf says, quote, "To put it crudely, the U.S. wants to inflate the rest of the world, while the latter is trying to deflate the U.S. The U.S. must win since it has infinite ammunition. There is no limit to the dollars the Federal Reserve can create. What needs to be discussed is the terms of the world's surrender."
No, because China, Russia, Iran, to name three, have figured out that with all the extra dollars in their bank accounts, all they need to do to totally screw up the U.S. economy is keep buying gold. And as gold keeps going higher, the U.S. is not very well prepared to deal with that contingency, and they can print all the money they want. It's only going to... what's the Chinese phrase? They say they're tomb builders.
Well, that's my next headline.
Yeah, tell the people.
U.S. is a currency wars two-maker, Chinese economist says. So this is in the People's Daily. And Li Jingyang says in a front-page commentary, the dollar's depreciation may appear to be market-driven. In reality, it is a depreciation colored by very strong, deliberate actions. And then he goes on to say, if the global financial crisis was about nationalizing private debt, then in the post-crisis period, the urgent need of the United States is to internationalize its national debt.
Yeah, internationalize its national debt. In other words, bundle it all up, securitize it, and put it into a special drawing right, or what do they call it, a bancor, or some world currency, and hope that it just goes away. And the rest of the world is saying, we don't think so. What we're going to do is we're going to destroy the U.S. dollar, keep buying gold bullion, and you have nothing to fight us back with because you're not going to depreciate your way out of this mess.
However, the gold is soaring, and you see that in the headline, gold explodes higher as the dollar is creamed again. But who is buying those dollars, Max? It's people like John Paulson. He's now placed all his money on gold. George Soros has, I read somewhere, put something like 50% of his wealth in gold. So they're the ones egging on the U.S. policymakers like Timothy Geithner to trash the dollar because, of course, they gain. The American citizen loses, but they gain.
No. Well, look, it's still a question of, this is the dynamic we have to keep in mind. Why is there no actual inflation on the ground, so to speak? Because the gaping hole in these economies, particularly in the U.S., we're talking about a multi-$100 trillion derivatives black hole. They keep printing money, but they're not able to actually benefit from the inflation of the money supply. All they're doing is inflating the ability of China and the rest of the world to successfully battle the U.S. in this global currency war. And China says, you're the tomb builder. What does that mean? You're digging your own grave. Okay? The U.S. is locked into digging its own grave. And what's the big criticism of Geithner you hear all the time? Geithner, you're in a hole. Stop digging. But for some reason, they're suicide bankers, as we point out on this show all the time. They seem incapable of stopping themselves from going down the path of market fundamentalism, which suggests there's an ideology of destroying yourself and your country in the belief that somehow you are a God's currency on earth.
Well, speaking of predatory bankers, this is the big story. It's been called fraud closure. It's been called foreclosure gate. Florida's 30-second foreclosure dash hits wall of fraud claims. So this is Bloomberg. And these guys, these fraudsters, were able to get 30-second foreclosures against people. And it turns out that, the documents were fraudulent.
But, not only are the foreclosure documents fraudulently created and signed and passed through the system, but the actual loan documents themselves to begin with were also fraudulently passed through the system. The onus is on the banker to make sure that the buyer can afford the loan. It's not the other way around. So the person who ends up with the fraudulent mortgage is victimized by being sold a fraudulent mortgage. Then he's fraudulently being foreclosed on. And then he probably has money in a pension account that owns a bundle and resecuritization of these foreclosed bonds in a collateralized foreclosed bonds obligation, collateralized obligation spew. And losing money in his pension account as well. So he's victimized 3 times by the same bank, including Wells Fargo, Charlie Munger's alma mater with Warren Buffett, who are, a chef and floor sweeper to the stars of criminal behavior on Wall Street and around the world.
Speaking of chefs and floor sweepers, banks caught hiring hairstylists, factory workers, and Burger King kids to sign foreclosure documents.
That's what I'm saying. That's how Charlie Munger got in the business. He's just a guy who was hanging out in Omaha, and Warren said, "Hey, you, buddy, there, sleeping on the park bench. Come on over here and keep me company while I cherry pick through these 10Ks and 10Qs and engage a little market manipulation and insider trading and call myself the guru and the wizard of Omaha." When in fact, as we now know, it's just predatory lending and a lot of other magics and tricks and alchemy as any other charlatan on Wall Street.
Hiring these stylists and Burger King workers, in the story, it mentions that none of these people hired to handle homeowner papers had any formal training in doing this.
Right.
Okay? Now this takes me to the next headline. Senior bankers lobby global regulators to help keep Britain competitive. So apparently, a small group of London's most senior bankers, including from Barclays and Lloyd's, the top guys, most of them living on the government paychecks now, have held a series of secret meetings on banking pay. But they only got so far with the regulators in the UK. So now they're going global. They're going to the global regulators. The lobbying is an admission that UK banks have moved as far forward as they can on the subjects as individuals and now need to act collectively if change is to happen.
These same bankers, by the way, as well as the Wall Street bankers, vehemently opposed a raise in the minimum wage. Meanwhile, the bankers are going to the world governments and saying, we need a minimum wage. We need a minimum amount of money to be paid per year to keep ransacking the system, or we'll take the ball and go home and you won't have any bank at all.
Yeah, they're saying that it helps Britain become competitive if they make more money. But if some Joe Bag of Donuts makes more money, that makes Britain uncompetitive for some reason, even though banking has been proven to provide no wealth creation.
No, here's what we do. Okay, you take all the bankers from HSBC, Lloyds of London, Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays Bank, right? You put them into one of these American privately owned prisons. You put them in that prison, and you give them $10 for the whole group of them. And you say the only way you can get out of prison is if you figure out how to do a leverage buyout of this prison while you're in prison, and only then and there can you gain your freedom. If you can't figure out how to leverage yourself and do a leverage buyout out of the prison that you just put into for effectively committing acts of fraud, securities violations, Securities Act violations, fraud, Securities Act of 33 and 34 fraud. There's nothing legitimate about anything they do. When they eat their breakfast in the morning, they're committing fraud.
I have another idea, Max. That is turning to those Burger King employees, those hairstylists that previously had no formal training. Now they have experience. I say we hire these guys as scabs, cross the global credit crunch picket line, displace these bankers, and put these Burger King and hairstylists into the job.
Right. All you need is that they have perfect training. They have the training of forging documents. Therefore, they can get a job at HSBC. They can get a job at Barclays. If you know how to forge documents, go to work at Citigroup. You can forge documents. Goldman Sachs has a job for you. You can forge documents. JP Morgan loves you because they hire criminals to conduct criminal acts. Now, this is the thing that I don't think people understand, that these bankers are involved in a crime syndicate. It's organized crime, like the mafia, like Al Capone. And at the end of the day, the Chinese are saying, holy mackerel, we're not buying into this, not one iota. And you know how we're going to take you down? We're going to drive gold up to a certain price that'll cause a dollar panic. And you see this already. The gold vigilantes are inducing a dollar selling panic. And, you know, the fact is that maybe it's time for America to step aside. They had their century, too many wars, not enough productivity, too many jackasses like Charlie Munger. Let's move on and let somebody else carry the ball for a while. All right, well, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more right after this.
Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Okay, time now to go to Los Angeles and talk with Ellen Brown, author of Web of Debt. Ellen Brown, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
Tell us about your new article just out in Yes magazine. Brace for another Lehman Brothers weekend. Foreclosure gate flaws appear to be incurable.
Well, what happened here was 62 million mortgages are held in the name of MERS, the Mortgage Electronic Registration Systems, which is just an electronic database. It doesn't own anything. It doesn't have any employees. It doesn't have a location. It's just electronic. And the reason they set it up that way was so that these mortgage-backed securities that all the mortgages are turned into would be investment grade for the investors. In order to get a AAA rating, the vehicle, the conduit that these mortgages would all pass through had to be what's called bankruptcy remote. That means that it couldn't own anything. So, in other words, if that entity, MERS, were to go bankrupt, it would take all the properties would wind up part of the bankrupt estate. And so, to avoid that, it is merely a conduit. So it's merely that the mortgages pass through it to the actual investors. That's the deal. That's the way it's set up. But the problem is courts have now held that MERS breaks the chain of title because MERS has been foreclosing in its own name. And the courts have held, of course, it's the defendants that have pushed this argument, but the courts have agreed that MERS can't own anything by its own admission. It doesn't own anything, and therefore it can't hold title, so it can't convey title, so it can't assign title to the real owners, who would be the investors. Whoever put up the money, those are the real owners. So now that banks are scrambling around. I mean, those lawsuits have been out there for 3 years now, ever since about, I think it was November of 2007. So they've been gradually, that argument has been gradually getting stronger. And so the banks are trying to get around it. And they've come up with this robo-signing ploy where people are signing it's just a few people. I mean, and these are not lower level people. These are high level people who know what they're doing. A few people are signing 10,000 affidavits a month in order to supposedly transfer the properties into these trusts so that the trusts can then foreclose. But the problem with that is the trusts are REMICs, which are real estate mortgage investment conduits. And they were set up in order to avoid taxes, but to comply with the tax laws, they have certain requirements, and one of them is that when you set up the REMIC, all your properties have to be in it right then. You can't add properties later. And also, the REMIC, too, as a trust, cannot own anything. It's just a conduit, and it's for the same reason, in order to avoid bankruptcy. It's supposed to be bankruptcy remote. So even if they manage to assign it to the trust, I mean, what they could arguably do is say it's the trust holding it for the beneficiary of the beneficiaries. But even then, who are the beneficiaries? They're the investors, and they don't know who the investors are who would actually wind up with this property or with the benefit of this property. So that's why they use the trust vehicle. Actually, the whole thing goes back to the repo market, which is the shadow banking system for the large institutional investors. These are investors that have more than $250,000. So they want a safe place to park their money overnight between investments. It would be like pension funds, mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds, all those great big investors. So they have huge amounts of money, but they don't actually feel safe putting it in a bank because they wouldn't be covered by the FDIC insurance because the limit's so low. So the shadow banking system is the repo market, which is all mortgage-backed securities or various forms of security. So it's basically a pawn shop where the special purpose vehicle, again, is a conduit. It's set up by the bank. It's supposed to be bankruptcy remote. It's remote from the bank so that if the bank goes bankrupt, the special purpose vehicle won't, or it won't affect those properties. So everything's funneled through the special purpose vehicle, and it's like one-day deals. It's like one-day pawn shop deals where the big investors put their money into the special purpose vehicle, but they can get it back the next day. So it's called a purchase and sale or repurchase agreement. But if it's a sale, then you've got a conflict here. Is it a sale or is it a securitization? If it's a sale, and if you're actually buying real estate, then according to state law, you're supposed to prove your chain of title if you're going to foreclose on this property. And that's what they haven't done. They've missed a step there in the chain of title, and there's just no way to get that chain of title back. That means they can't foreclose on these properties. So all the investors have then is not actually a secured interest. All they have is an interest in equity. They can go to court and say, we've lost X amount of money on these properties. But again, they're going to have trouble showing that that particular money was attached to that particular property. And many of these investors have been paid in other ways, for instance, through the insurance, which it's credit default swaps, which is characterized as a form of insurance. In fact, many of them have been paid multiple times over. I saw Neil Garfield, who's a big foreclosure expert, said that these properties, say it's a $300,000 property, it's worth a lot more to the investors if it defaults than if it doesn't, because there might be 30 credit default swaps synthetic collateralized debt obligations on this property. So if the tenants keep paying, then it's, or not tenants, the owners keep paying, then it's worth $300,000 to them. But if they default, then it's worth $9 million because of the nature of the credit default swaps. So they actually had a motive to suck in really bad pieces of real estate because they wanted them to default. They had a certain threshold level. If X, like 8% or whatever, if some percentage went into default, then they get paid on their credit default swap. Well, they'd rather have that than have the property. So the whole thing is a huge scam, a huge racket, a fraud on the investors and a fraud on the homeowners. The homeowners are just being used. I mean, their properties are just being used as pawn shop, pieces in this big casino.
These foreclosures are to a legitimate transaction what a chicken McNugget is to a chicken.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the reason I say this is because the mortgages enter this whirlwind, this MERS system, and it becomes something of a blender and a processor, and they process and they continue to sell and resell and repo and add layer and layer of toxicity and resecuritization. And what comes out the other side is sold on to the wholesale market as a legitimate security. But it has no relation to a legitimate security as a chicken McNugget has to a chicken. A chicken McNugget is made out of nothing but, toxic components and virtually no chicken whatsoever. So these securities that are now circulating in the system are actually have no relationship to being a legitimate security in any way, shape, or form. They're literally trading confetti and calling that a legitimate business and paying themselves huge bonuses. And their only answer is to go back and to get Congress to retroactively pass laws to cover their behinds. The exact same thing we saw in the telecom industry. They were caught breaking the law, and they got Congress to retroactively change the law. Now the banks got caught breaking laws again, and their answer is to get Congress to retroactively change the law. Oh, wow, that's a really good model to show the kids in America. It doesn't matter if you break the law. You can always change the law post hoc, and therefore you're innocent. Let's move on to a hot topic here. What is a greenbacker, and how does that relate to the economy?
During the 1890s, I've written a book called Web of Debt, and the reason I wrote it was that I discovered that The Wizard of Oz was actually written as a monetary allegory in the 1890s. And it was the greenbackers who were marching in 1894. They were marching on Washington because they wanted to go back to the greenback system of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, when he was forced to borrow heavily to fund the Civil War, instead agreed to issue treasury notes that were non-interest-bearing treasury notes. In other words, and these were called greenbacks. They were just money printed by the government. So you could call that fiat money, or you could call it what it really is, which is a receipt for goods and services received by the government. So the government pays the soldiers with these little receipts, acknowledging that the soldiers have served and that they've served their country and they are owed this amount of money, and then they can go and trade those receipts in the community for equal value, and that is what money is.
Money comes in three basic flavors. You've got non-interest-bearing paper money, which is the greenback. You've got interest-bearing paper money that comes from the Fed, which is outside of Congress, and charges America huge interest for circulating that paper money. And then you've got gold-backed money. So the people typically who are arguing against having non-interest-bearing greenback-type money are typically people who are into the gold money-backed solution. Everyone agrees the Fed is a dirty dog and that Bernanke is basically, lower than snake poop. But so that leaves non-interest-bearing greenback money or gold-backed money. So why is the non-interest-bearing greenback money, in your opinion, superior, as I understand it, to gold-backed money?
We had gold-backed money all through the 19th century, and that was what was wrong in the 1890s. The people did not have the gold. The gold was held by the bankers, and so the bankers would issue their paper money supposedly backed by gold, but they didn't have nearly as much gold as they were issuing paper. And so you'd have these periodic runs on the banks. The bankers were empowered to collapse the money supply whenever they wanted to. They would just call their loans in. And then because all money was created by bankers backed by this, supposedly backed by gold, they were in total control of the system, and they caused periodic depressions, which would throw people into bankruptcy. They would lose their farms.
Well, actually, Ellen Brown, let me cut in here. The foreclosure fraud scandal ended up taking up a lot of our interview here this afternoon, so we're going to have to cut it off here. But I want to have you back on and continue up on this discussion of the gold-backed versus non-interest versus interest-bearing paper money, because it is becoming more of a factor as the U.S. dollar, which is the Federal Reserve interest-bearing money, is losing favor in the globe. And now that there's a kind of a rush to see how the global economy is going to be re-architected and reconfigured, what is going to be the new form of money. Clearly, the U.S. dollar won't be around in another 10 years. So hopefully we can come back and discuss this a little bit more if that's okay with you.
Yes, certainly.
Ellen Brown, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Ellen Brown, author of Web of Debt. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.